Hello everyone, today we're going to discuss few horrible fates. Please let us know in the comments section if you want to see more videos like this. Now let's get into it. The small town of Krebs, Oklahoma seems normal enough on the surface, but below ground it holds a dark and terrible secret. Krebs was home to the Osage Coal and Mining Company, which was at the heart of the town's economy. But one fateful day, Osage's coal mine would become a grave and the site of disaster that was the worst mining disaster in the state's history, and also one of the worst mining accidents of all time. But the 1892 incident wouldn't be the last time that the name Osage would make headlines in the mining community, as decades later a town bearing the Osage name would suffer a string of mining catastrophes that would haunt the nation for decades. Krebs is a small, quaint town that started when a post office was built in the area on February 10, 1886. However, this simple post office was part of the ongoing Trail of Tears, which is one of the darkest times in American history. Before the post office of Krebs was founded, the land belonged to the Choctaw Nation and lands that were called Indian Territory. Back then, the United States had a policy to remove Native American populations from U.S. land in exchange for land grants. These new lands would largely be sovereign, independent states, but some of these lands were also unorganized. Before Oklahoma became a U.S. state, it was home to a mix of unorganized, independent, so-called Indian Territory and the sovereign state of the Choctaw. The Choctaw Nation has roots dating back as far as the year 800 Common Era during the Mississippian era in the areas around present-day Alabama. By the year 1500, the Choctaw emerged as a distinct people with their own language and 3 different subcultures. They fought alongside the U.S. during the American Revolution and the War of 1812 only to get betrayed numerous times over the course of 20 years. The Choctaw were displaced to Oklahoma after the land was acquired from the Louisiana Purchase. After the Civil War, the U.S. adopted a new plan. Instead of forcing Native American populations onto new land, the U.S. decided to take the land they had originally offered and grant any remaining population citizenship. This was a huge controversy that can still be a heated topic to this day. The land the Choctaw were originally forced onto was subdivided by the U.S. federal government with the Dawes Act, and their territory became known as Oklahoma Territory. The Choctaw were then shoved around once more when Oklahoma became a state in 1907. As Krebs began to develop alongside the region's impending statehood, companies from around the country started to eye the place for potential business opportunities. The Osage Coal and Mining Company capitalized on the U.S. government's change in policy to become the first commercial mining company on Native American territory. Shortly after, the Atoka Coal and Mining Company also set up shop on the newly taken land. Both Osage and Atoka were subsidiaries of the Missouri Pacific Railroad, or MOPAC, which was one of the first railroads in operation west of the Mississippi River. Prior to mining on Native American land, the Osage Coal and Mining Company also had mines in Missouri and Kansas. Osage's first acquisition came in 1872 with a mine 3 miles east of McAllister at the newly christened town of Krebs. The Choctaw's law enabled the person who discovered any minerals to lease the land in a 1-mile radius. Royalties on that land were paid to the finder and to both the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. While the royalties would have been far greater if the Choctaw didn't have more invaders to lay claim to their land, MOPAC paid a total of roughly $2 million over the course a little over 20 years, adjusted for inflation that comes to about $48 million. Over that same span of time, Osage mined 226,523 tons of coal. They paid rock-bottom prices at only 60 cents per ton of raw coal. Osage's operation in Krebs was leased to the company from a man named William Pulsey in 1875. To make matters worse for the Choctaw, Osage was a direct competitor. Up until the U.S. changed their policy, the Choctaw were already mining their lands. At the time, they held one of the strongest mining companies in the United States, and Osage's invasion threatened to dethrone the Choctaw. At the time of their Krebs acquisition, Osage was the 4th highest-ranked mining operation with a total of 800 employees. Osage employed mostly English and Irish miners looking to make their American dream a reality, but in Krebs, the mining population was comprised of mostly Italian and Russian immigrants. Eventually, the Italian heritage of the town gave Krebs its modern nickname, Oklahoma's Little Italy. The Industrial Revolution started at the end of the 1700s, which gave rise to new mining technologies and new reforms for workers' rights. However, miners were still faced with notoriously difficult conditions. Even if miners survived the dangers of the cramped, dark stone, they were often faced with chronic lung diseases and hearing loss. Unfortunately, unsafe working conditions were a part of life for the workers at Krebs. Because the land was held on Native American soil, the mines weren't subject to federal regulations. This meant that there were even less regulations compared with other mines. Krebs' lack of federal laws made it an attractive place for companies like Osage. Fewer regulations meant the company could save money by skipping safety features, skipping survey work, and reducing or ignoring equipment and infrastructure maintenance. Osage squeezed even more money out of their miners by forcing them to work long hours without proper training periods for new miners. These short-term money-saving solutions would end up costing the lives of hundreds of works and mark the beginning of the end for the company. All of these factors were at play at Osage's number 11 mine at Krebs, where they employed old mining techniques. Old techniques known as conventional mining used what's called blast mining. Miners began by cutting into the coal bed to make it easier to break apart. Then they would use dynamite or other explosives to quickly break apart coal seams. The coal and waste rubble were then loaded onto shuttle cars and conveyors. Other workers would then sift through the material and ship the coal off-site. This mining method dates back to the year 1627, when Hungary started using gunpowder instead of pickaxes and other tools. On January 7th, a newly hired miner accidentally set flame to a stockpile of explosives, which sent an enormous blast through the mine. Explosive stockpiles were stored near the surface and away from the actual blast sites to avoid triggering an unwanted chain reaction. Whenever a blast was scheduled, dynamite would be transferred to new coal beds where cutting patterns were already created. Then holes would be drilled to place the dynamite into the rock to improve its ability to break apart the stone. Miners would then be evacuated above ground. Since the explosion came without warning, miners didn't have time to escape. The blast collapsed lower sections of the mine, and miners were trapped or crushed under tons of rubble. But the miners who were transporting materials or taking a break near the surface were the most vulnerable, since the stockpile was near heavily trafficked parts of the mine. The blast burned nearby workers, and others were killed instantly by the high-pressure blast. Almost every household in Krebs either had someone working in the mines or were related to someone in the mines. The incident caused widespread panic in the growing town of Krebs. The catastrophe was called the third worst mining accident of the 19th century at the time, and it remains the worst mining disaster in Oklahoma's history. The total death toll ranges between 67 and 100 men, while another 200 miners suffered injuries. Eventually, in 2002, the town of Krebs created a memorial site where the old mine used to stand. The memorial holds the names of those who died at the 1892 Krebs mining disaster. Over the coming years, Osage fought a social battle on multiple fronts. On one hand, they had to deal with pressure from local populations that they were displacing, and they also had to contend with low morale from their own workers who dealt with poor work conditions with little pay. The company tired to make a step in the right direction in 1896, when Superintendent of Mining for Osage, William Cameron, invented the long wall system of mining. Longwall mines use machines to mine long veins of coal in a single slice rather than breaking the coal haphazardly with explosives. As machines cut the coal with large slices, the overhanging waste rock can fall in a controlled way. This system improved productivity while also creating a safer workplace environment. The longwall system was so effective that most large mining operations adopted it, and today, longwall mining accounts for over 50% of all underground mining production. But the longwall method was too little and too late for Osage. In 1894, miners organized a large-scale protest which shut down most of Osage's operations on Native American territory. These protests eventually resulted in the creation of the first installation of the United Mine Workers on Native American soil. Later in 1912, the town rebounded, and entrepreneurial coal miners created a weekly newspaper called the Oklahoma Miner. The Great Depression of 1929 was the last straw for Osage's operations in Oklahoma. In 1929, the company shut down its number 11 mine at Krebs and auctioned off its remaining equipment. However, that wasn't the last time the name Osage would be at the center of tragedy. The 1942 Osage mine catastrophe. Alongside the Choctaw Nation were the people of the Osage Nation. Like the Choctaw, they have a long history dating back to the year 700 CE. The name Osage actually comes from French settlers who discovered the tribe and named them after a phrase which means calm water, while the Osage referred to themselves as the Washaji, or Midwaters. Despite the mistranslation, an unincorporated town sprang up in West Virginia named Osage. This West Virginia community also became a mining operation in the mid-1900s. Instead of the Osage Coal and Mining Company laying claim to the community that shared their name, the mining operation at Osage, West Virginia, was ran by the Christopher Coal Company and the Pursglove Company. At Christopher Coal's number 3 mine in Osage, someone left a ventilation door open which diverted the flow of fumes and returned them back into the mine. Over the course of the day on May 12, 1942, methane gas built up in one of the mine shafts. There, the methane built up pressure, and the gas mixed with dust in the air to allow electricity to flow more freely through the air. At 2:25 p.m., a spark arced across one of the mining machines and set off a huge explosion as the methane caught fire. The ventilation equipment was the first to explode, and the pressure triggered sections of the roof to collapse. Once the explosion died down, rescue operations went underway. But even after the workers were saved, the disaster continued as 3 more miners suffocated in the unbreathable fumes of what are called afterdamp gases. In total, 56 people died that day at Osage, West Virginia. Then, in July of that same year, Osage, West Virginia was hit by another mining disaster when a roof collapsed at Pursglove's No. 2 mine. This collapse caused an explosion which killed 20 more miners. The string of mining tragedies associated with the Osage name finally came to an end in 1943 after one more disaster. This time, a vehicle that hauled coal in and out of the mine caught fire. This fire spread to the coal seam itself, which killed another 12 people, bringing the total death toll in the town of Osage to 89, and putting the overall mining deaths associated with the Osage name to close to 200. That's the tragic tale of how the Osage namesake left a string of disasters in the mining community. First, with the Osage Coal and Mining Company at Krebs, Oklahoma, and later at Osage, West Virginia. In spite of the catastrophes in the mining industry, mining remains an important part of many communities around the country.
In the decades following the 1926 eruption and the decimation of the town of Honua Flow, a newfound fear of the world's largest volcano, Mauna Loa, had taken hold on the island of Hawaii. Despite multiple incidents that would reliably send everyone into a panic, it wouldn't be until 1950 that everyone's fears were eventually realized in full. That's the year Mauna Loa let out the biggest eruption in its entire modern history. It was June 1st, just weeks before the start of summer in the tropical paradise of Hawaii. In 1950, it was still 9 years away from becoming a U.S. state, but Hawaii was already a major vacation destination, particularly for residents of the United States. World War II had ended 5 years earlier, and the U.S. was experiencing an economic boom like no other. Traveling to a warm, relaxing island paradise for a vacation was just the thing many felt like they needed. But of course, Hawaii is more than just a peaceful fantasy land. It's a remote island chain formed by explosive lava deep under the Earth's surface. And that day, the people on the Big Island were about to get a very dramatic wake-up call. The first signs that something was coming appeared about a week earlier. On March 25th, just before the crack of dawn, an earthquake shook people awake in their hotel beds. It wasn't big enough to do much damage, but everybody felt it, whether they were in the East Coast town of Hilo or the West Coast town of Kona. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the shaking stopped. Startled, but perhaps hoping it was just something the island does every once in a while, most visitors went back to sleep, naively thinking this would be the last they'd hear from the island's natural forces. That hope was shattered 4 days later, on March 29th. In the middle of the afternoon, another earthquake struck. Now, if the last quake had been enough to startle the people on the island, well, this one was enough to scare the living hell out of them. It clocked in at a magnitude of 6.4 on the Richter scale. Earthquakes of that magnitude are relatively quite rare, and in populated areas they can inflict significant damage to people and property. Residents of Kona reported damage as serious as the destruction of stone walls and water tanks. As far as we know, nobody was killed, but there was a definite shift in the attitude of those who were there at the time. One mild earthquake is easily brushed off. 2, within the span of a few days, with the second being significantly stronger than the first, is a sign that something sinister might be brewing. Whether they knew it or not, something was brewing, and it was brewing directly beneath their feet. Lava. The earthquakes, which were coming in what geologists call a swarm, signaled that Mauna Loa was in a state of growing unrest. Geologists working on the island had been aware of this unrest for months. Through very precise surveying, they had observed that Kilauea, Mauna Loa's volcanic next-door neighbor, had actually tilted slightly. This was the result of a process called deformation, which happens when magma is moving underneath the surface of the Earth. To produce a measurable tilt at another volcano nearby, Mauna Loa had to have been experiencing very significant amounts of magma movement. But as far as anybody knew, this wasn't a sure sign of any imminent catastrophe. There's always magma moving around beneath Hawaii, and a sudden increase doesn't necessarily mean there will be an eruption. It was just something for scientists to keep a close eye on. What followed next would all happen very quickly and with little warning. After a day of tranquil sunshine, the sun had set over Hawaii on June 1st. The memory of the unsettling earthquake from a few days before was just starting to wear off, perhaps with the help of a few strawberry daiquiris. At 9 p.m., most tourists had paid their dinner bill and were either out dancing to a jukebox or back at the hotel putting the kids to bed. But by 9:30, everything on the island had changed. Following another swarm of earthquakes, this time in much more rapid succession, people were all at once able to see a hellish orange glow coming from high in the sky at the center of the island behind them. It's possible that even now visitors would have been perplexed as to what was going on, but surely the local residents knew. Mauna Loa was erupting, and the skyward glow was lava pouring out of the summit. In the night sky, this would have been hard to see, but above the summit of Mauna Loa there was also a huge mushroom cloud reaching toward the heavens. This cloud, made of volcanic gas emissions, would eventually rise as high as 10,000 feet above the summit of Mauna Loa, almost 24,000 feet above the surrounding sea. A fissure had opened at the top of the mountain that was roughly 2.5 miles long. Like a colossal wound, this fresh gash in Mauna Loa was spewing molten lava out and down the side toward the west. Worse still, the wound kept growing. In their record of the event, the U.S. Geological Survey described what happened as, quote, unzipping. By 10:30, an 11-mile trail of lava fountains wound down the side of Mauna Loa, all of them bursting and bubbling simultaneously. Now, there are two things in particular about these lava fountains that are amazing. First, they were high volume and extremely large. Along this 11-mile trail, which must have looked like the Bellagio from hell, there were fountains spouting as high as 200 feet in the air. At times, quick bursts were seen rising as high as almost 300 feet in the air. Just so you know, that's not that far off from the actual height of the Bellagio fountain show in Las Vegas. Only instead of water, it was 2,000-degree lava. And instead of being 1,000 feet wide, it was 11 miles. Oh, and don't forget, instead of being human-operated, it was completely out of human control, and heading for places where lots of humans were located. Which brings us to the second thing that was so extraordinary. These lava fountains were producing lava flows down the side of the volcano, and to date, they are the fastest moving lava flows ever recorded at Mauna Loa. Within 3 hours, a major lava flow had traveled all the way down the mountain and reached the ocean in South Kona. Other flows were not far behind, slithering back and forth on the way down and overlapping like braids. The flow that only took 3 hours was called the Honua Flow, so named because of the town it threatened upon its initial emergence around 12:20 a.m. At 12:20, the flow was roughly a mile or so above Highway 11, which connects Hilo to Kona by running around the perimeter of the island. But just 10 minutes later, by 12:30, the Honua Flow had rolled right over the highway. It then proceeded in the very unfortunate direction of a gas station, which it blew up and destroyed. It also destroyed more than a few homes before the grand finale. On a remote island full of visitors before the age of cell phones, it destroyed the local post office. Other flows were not much kinder. A few hours later, in the early morning hours of June 2nd, another flow called the Kahoku Flow also barreled over the crippled highway, only a little over a mile south of where the last flow had split it in half. Several more homes were decimated completely by this second flow. The flow also had the nerve to knock over and then meld a huge row of coconut trees, replacing the tranquil scenery with fire, smoke, and ash. As the day broke over Hawaii on June 2nd, the chaos continued to build upon itself. Around noon, a group of people consisting of police, Observatory personnel and just plain maniacs wanting to look at the eruption were all congregated along Highway 11. They were, for their own various reasons, looking to try and see yet another major flow called the Kapuna Flow that was headed their way. The National Guard, whose planes were watching the lava race toward these people from above, made contact with the crowd and suggested that they go away. Thankfully, the warning was heeded, and less than 2 hours later, the Kapuna Flow ripped right through the already mangled Highway 11. It was estimated at the time that lava was racing toward the ocean at speeds of up to 30 miles an hour, significantly faster than even gold medal Olympic sprinters running at full speed. You could not outrun it, you definitely could not withstand it, and nobody could do much of anything to stop it. All anybody could do was try their best to get out of the way and say farewell to whatever they left behind, whether cars, houses, or anything else. The last new flow to form was the Kahoku Flow, emerging very early on June 3rd. However, the existing lava flows continued for an astonishing 23 days. This polluted the air tremendously with a unique smog scientists call VOG. Part of what was clouding the air even further was steam from the ocean. Multiple lava flows actually continued down the side of the volcano underwater, remaining hot enough to continue along their melty path. Observatory personnel actually had a pretty cool way of tracking how far these underwater lava flows went, by looking at the trails of steam above them. Astoundingly, the furthest made it about a half-mile out to sea before finally solidifying. When it was all finally over 23 days later, Mauna Loa had spit out a record-breaking 376 million cubic meters of lava onto the island. That's close to 100 billion gallons. Miraculously, nobody was killed, thanks to the work of local authorities to keep the public safe and out of the way of the flows. Property on the island wasn't so lucky, however. The 1950 eruption destroyed around 24 buildings, including a gas station and a post office. It also ruined the highway. In a series of swift, messy slices, it left about a mile of the highway missing in total. Such a massive eruption at such a pivotal time in Hawaii's history impacted public perception of the islands. The general public, particularly tourists, were more aware of the volcanic aspect of Hawaii's idyllic allure. Many were fascinated and drawn even more toward this boon for natural exploration. Others were frightened and perhaps discouraged from visiting. The truth is that your chances of being killed by a volcanic eruption when visiting Hawaii are infinitesimally small. Less than 100 people have died in the recorded history of the island, and with technological advances in seismic monitoring and communications, it gets less and less likely every decade. Still, Mauna Loa is an undeniable force to be reckoned with. Its ability to spontaneously impose its will on the visitors and residents of the island, and to make them watch helplessly while infrastructure and property get liquefied, is pretty terrifying. We can only hope that one day Mauna Loa won't break its own record and let out an even bigger eruption than it did in 1950. We hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Would you visit Hawaii during a volcanic eruption? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and please be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content like this in the near future. That's all for now. See you next time.